Hello and welcome back to my channel In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and today I am going to rank my Victober reads. So this was my very first Victober. Definitely will not be my last. I had so much fun expanding my knowledge of Victorian reads. And I read quite a few actually. I read 5. I read 6 Victorian novels written by Victorian authors. And then I read 4 books written more contemporary times, but set in Victorian era. I read 2 nonfiction books and I read works by a couple of different Victorian poets. So let's dig in and see what I thought about all of those Victober reads. First of all, let's start with the poets. I read some of the poems by Charlotte and Emily and Anne Bronte. I read a few by each of them. Anne Bronte's seemed more like a little bit sentimental to me, and they were good. They were good poems and like nice to read, but they were definitely more along like the sentimental aspect of things. And then Emily's, as one would expect, were much darker and had darker elements and themes to them. And then Charlotte's I found the most interesting because of the vantage point or the perspective from which her poems were told. Very interesting. Like the first one in the book was about Pilate's wife, and she's just waking up from having her dream about Pilate trying Jesus. And the dream isn't really described. The poem is really just about what she's feeling, about what she dreamed and the emotions that it stirred and her dread and her fear. And also there's some disdain for her husband mixed in there, and she knows she needs to tell him, but she's sure he's not going to listen to her, and she's right. And anyway, very interesting poem all around. I found it fascinating. I also read, and I know he doesn't technically count as Victorian because he's American, but he was apparently friends with Charles Dickens, so I mean, you know, that's a connection, right? I also read a couple of poems by Edgar Allan Poe, reread, I should say, The Bells and The Raven, and I just find both of those poems just so mesmerizing in their rhythmic quality and in the, he uses alliteration and also just, I know there are technical words for these things, but like repeated sounds within words, and a lot of imagery, a lot of feeling is evoked by the word, like, you know, by the way he writes the poem. I just really enjoy his poetry. It's just a very rich experience, and he's probably not all of, I don't like all his poems, but the ones that I really like and are probably like my favorite poems. So between those two, I would say the Bronte sisters, I would rank in this order: Charlotte being my favorite, Emily next, and then Anne Bronte. And then Edgar Allan Poe is just one of my favorites all around. So that was that. That was the poetry that I read. Then I read some nonfiction. I'm actually still working on this one, John Ploughman's Talk, which is by Charles Spurgeon, and it seems to be like maybe news, like a column in a newspaper, like an editorial column type of thing. I'm not really sure. That's what it seems to be like. If I could put it in modern terms, each chapter seems to be kind of like a blog post about a particular topic, and each blog post, each chapter, each little article is just basically one pithy proverb after another. It's like reading the book of Proverbs, and it's all like on a specific topic of character or, you know, life matters, kind of like advice for someone. Yeah, like a lot of advice, like an advice column sort of thing. And he's just very cuttingly witty, makes me laugh out loud sometimes. One of the chapters is about gossip, and he says, What a pity that there is not a tax upon words. What an income would come from it. But alas, talking pays no toll. So sad. And then he says, an open mouth shows an empty head. Let's see. And this was a good one. Not so funny, but just a good, pithy little statement. Yet regard for truth should put a bit into every honest man's mouth and a bridle upon every good woman's tongue. I like this one in the chapter about patience. Grin and bear it is the old-fashioned advice, but sing and bear it is a great deal better. And then this, this is funny. Sorrows are visitors that come without invitation, but complaining minds send a wagon to bring their troubles home in. So true. I know some people like that. And this also, so true. He who knows nothing is confident in everything. So the funniest one that I read most recently in the chapter about opportunities. So this is about people who they waste opportunities that are given to them for whatever reason. Either they're too lazy or they don't see them, or, you know, they're happy where they are and they don't want to take life by the horns and go after anything. And he says, they are no more worth than an old almanac. Their time has gone for being of use, but unfortunately you cannot throw them away as you would an old almanac, for they are like the cross old lady who had an annuity left her and meant to take out the full value of it. They won't die, though they are of no use alive. Well, Spurgeon, tell us what you really think, okay? Anyways, full of funny little pithy comments like that on various topics. The first chapter was about the idle and about being idle, and was just very, very hard-hitting with very good practical advice. So lots of wisdom here, but it's not like a you know, a story or like he's building to a point. Each chapter can be read individually. So kind of interesting in that way. So that one, I'm probably 4 stars for that one. And then I also read The Five by Hallie Rubenthold, I believe is her name, which was about the 5 murder victims of Jack the Ripper in Victorian England. And very extremely well researched. She did like so much research, and it was very easy to read, very well written, very compelling stories of all of these women and their lives. I talked a lot about it in another video, which I'll link below, so I won't go into any more details here, but I really enjoyed that one, and that one would be like 4.5 stars for me. And even if you're not particularly interested in, like, you don't like true crime kind of stories or whatever, it's really not about the crimes themselves. It's more about the life of the working class in London. So if that interests you at all, in Victorian London, and if that interests you at all, very eye-opening and very interesting, very well researched on all aspects of that. So totally worth reading. And I really enjoyed that one. Then as far as the novels that I read that were not actually Victorian, but were set in Victorian times, I read, first of all, the lowest ranked one would be John Eyre by Mimi Matthews, and I posted a whole rant about that. I won't go into details about it. I gave it 2.5 stars. I enjoyed reading it. I read all the way through the end. There's a lot that I like about the book. Just some of the themes that I just, the main points actually, I just kind of disagreed with. And so that kind of made me not love it as much. Not be a book that I would recommend to everyone. But if you like Gothic reads and retellings of classics, because she's retelling 2 different classic stories there, classic Victorian novels, you'll probably enjoy it. So it was very well written. I will say that for it. And then I also read Isabel and Alexander by, I believe, Rebecca Anderson, and that I gave 3 stars. And it was good. It was just not super memorable in any way for me. Like, it was a nice story, and it was nicely told, set in Victorian times in Manchester. The man in the story, so it's a romance novel, so there's the man in the story owns a mill, a cotton mill, and then it's an arranged marriage story, not necessarily marriage of convenience, but an arranged marriage story. But beyond that, there is like earlier on in the story, earlier on in their married life, they already have complications being an arranged marriage, and, you know, with her being young or whatever. Anyway, and like, you know, there's some slight difference in social class, whatever. So there's already issues to start with that they're having to work through. But then tragedy happens, and it's about how the tragedy seems to drive them farther apart at first, but in the end draws them together and how they overcome that tragedy. So it's good. It's a sweet story, pretty well written. I give it 3 stars overall. And then The Lost Melody by Joanna Davidson Politano was another one that I read. It was largely set in a insane asylum in the Victorian times. So that was really interesting. And that one has like a whole vibe, a whole atmosphere. All of Politano's books are very atmospherical, very lyrical. The prose is very lyrical. Sometimes I feel like the plot suffers a little bit at the hands of the prose. And so there's not like in my mind, a perfect balance of those. But I did really enjoy this one. I really enjoyed the tying in of music and musical therapy into that, and the beginnings of the beginning history of music as therapy, which I found fascinating. And it was a good book overall. So I give that one 4 stars. And then Glass Town was a graphic novel based on the stories that the Bronte children wrote as like teenagers and even young adults. And that also is really well done. And I raved about that in one of my wrap-ups in October. I just really liked almost everything about it. It was very enjoyable. And there was a little bit of like a wistfulness about it, because Charlotte, all of her siblings have passed away, and she's looking back at the adventures that they created together with their stories, and she's interacting with the characters and kind of processing her grief at losing her siblings in such a tragic way and so soon. And so I think that was the aspect of it for me that really drew me to it. Kind of just that added an extra layer of it. It wasn't just the stories that they created. It wasn't about that. It was also about Charlotte processing her loneliness and her grief and mourning and being able to move on to the next phase of her life. So that was really well done. And I gave that 4 stars. Probably I could give it 5 stars because I really enjoyed it that much. So that brings me to the actual Victorian novels that I read. So to start with, 3 Men in a Boat, I gave 3.5 stars. It was funny. It was interesting. The narrator and his 3 buddies are taking a camping boat trip down the Thames, and it's about their adventures and misadventures and the dog that is with him. And all along the way, he goes off on these hilarious little rabbit trails, and it's very amusing and entertaining. I didn't find it personally like super laugh out loud funny all the way along, and it's probably not a book I would pick up and reread, but I did enjoy reading it. I enjoyed the experience, and it's an interesting slice of Victorian literature that is nothing like, you know, Dickens, for example. It's much more like everyday kind of person sort of read, and not, you know, super highbrow or anything like that. And then I had a whole bunch of 4-star books. So let's start with the one I read first, which was Phantastes. So Phantastes is by Scottish author George MacDonald, and it is one of the early fantasy stories, maybe one of the first, and he's drawing on the fairy tale genre to write this story. And so there's lots of elements of that in here. There's a lot of imagery and symbolism, and you really need a little bit of context to understand it thoroughly. Some of it I caught as I was reading on my own, but I then listened to some experts talk about it, read a little bit about it, so to give me a little more insight. So it stands alone as you know, like a fairy tale kind of story on its own as a fantasy story, but it's a lot more interesting and compelling if you can understand exactly what you're reading and what George MacDonald was alluding to in various parts of the story. So definitely good, but unless you are already an expert in all things literary, you may need a little bit of help to guide you along with this one, but worth it for sure. A good story to read. I finished Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. I really enjoyed both of these stories about Alice. I had read Alice in Wonderland earlier this year, and I had started through The Looking Glass, but hadn't finished it. So I finished it in October and was very glad that I did. Such an interesting and intriguing story, like so fast paced, and you know, moving through these like pieces on the chessboard, and the different adventures that Alice has in each one. That setup was just so interesting, such a fun way to tell a story. If a little bit like, you know, a little bit of whiplash, because you're like changing scenes like this and characters, you know, shifting and moods changing rapidly. So very fast moving, and I enjoyed it overall. Probably not something that I would sit down and reread over and over again, but I did enjoy that. Gave that 4 stars. I read A Dark Knight's Work by Elizabeth Gaskell, and I have not posted about that one yet, so I'll go into a little more detail with this one. So I have read most of Gaskell's full-length novels. I still need to read Ruth and Sylvia's Lovers, but apparently she has a whole bunch of shorter stories and novellas that I did not know at all about. I had read one of them, The Moorland Cottage, I believe it's called, which was a sweet story. But I did not know of the others, and there are apparently a lot of them. So I realized here I thought I was almost finished with my Gaskell catalog, but it just like doubled. So I have a lot more to read. So I read A Dark Knight's Work, which is one of her novellas, and such an interesting plot to write about, such an interesting topic or theme. So the heroine in our story, Eleanor, she is a witness to a man's death at the hands of another man with whom she is intimately acquainted, a relative of hers. And together, she and the person who committed the crime and a servant are all conspirators in covering up the man's death. And the story explores what happens to these 3 people after that. So there is a lot of, you know, the themes in this book are really about struggling with guilt and shame and secrets and how it affects each person. And spoiler alert, it doesn't do anything good, that's for sure. So each of these 3 people struggled in their own way, in one way or another, and this negatively affected and impacted their lives on physical level, emotional level, spiritual level, and in every way. And this book also explores how best to love someone who has done something very wrong. What is the best way? Is the best way to cover it up for them, to assist them in covering it up? Is that the ideal way to love and support someone like that? Or is it to shun them and dismiss them because of the shame and the embarrassment? Is it to bear the burden of their guilt and shame yourself in an effort to absolve them and maybe even absolve yourself in the process? Or is there a better way? And there's only one character in the story who potentially is able to demonstrate the best kind of loving reaction in this sort of circumstance. But unfortunately for him, he's not really given the opportunity to fully demonstrate his ability to do that at the time when it was really needed. It's a good couple decades later before he is able to really show like a steadfast, loyal kind of love, but it's not one that brushes things under the rug or excuses things or dismisses things, but confronts truth, you know, and reality head on and deals with, you know, whatever it is, whatever the shame is or the guilt is, you know, head on without any recrimination or dismissal or even denial. Like there's not any denial of, you know, guilt or whatever. So anyway, really interesting story. I found the beginning of it a little bit choppy. So I only gave it 4 stars. I had a hard time like understanding the flow in the beginning, and the characters were, I don't know. I feel like the story started in one place that didn't really have too much to do with the actual story or the plot line, and then it veered and took a different perspective from a different direction and with different characters and whatever. I don't know. I found it a little bit hard to follow in the beginning. But then about a third of the way through it, when things really started to happen in the story and it took a more of a consistent flow through the plot, I was like, sorry, books just fell. And I have a fruit fly flying around. It's so annoying. Go away. Anyway, I was able to track it a lot better and found it much more interesting. So then I read also Silas Marner by George Eliot, which I really enjoyed also. Very good book. And also, again, a different kind of story, not one that we often, not one that's often told from the perspective of an older, well, like middle-aged man, but who seems, much older than that to the people who know him. And it's kind of starting, in the middle of his life, and he's got a lot of things in his past that haven't been fully processed. And then there's more things that he has to work through in the course of this story as it goes on. It's a very kind of symmetrical story, the way it's told, kind of like in thirds almost. There's like 3/3 to the story. I mean, obviously there would be 3/3, right? Because that's what a third is. But anyway, very interesting. He gains some things and then he loses some things, but then he finds out what, is really worth having in life. And in the course of it, he's able to process the things that happened to him when he was young. And it's a very heartwarming story in the end, when everything is all said and done. I enjoyed it very much. It was a good book. I did find, especially in the beginning, but also sprinkled throughout, I mean, I feel like George Eliot is probably not my favorite author. The story itself was fine, but some of her prose was just it was just extra. Too many words, first of all, a lot of extra words, and just a little bit too much, like, I don't know, condescension maybe, a little bit of an uppity kind of feel to it or tone to it. If you have read a lot of George Eliot and you have thoughts, let me know what you think. I didn't love it for the writing, for the narration and the prose aspect of it. The actual story was good, and I liked what she was doing with the story and where she was going and all of that stuff. But there were just some other aspects of it I was like, just rubbed me the wrong way. Didn't really love it. So I gave that one 4 stars. My one and only 5-star read, which is not unusual for me, by the way. I'm pretty stingy with those 5 stars. I save them for books that I really love, that are the kind of books that I can recommend without caveat, and that are books worth savoring and worth rereading. So the only one I gave 5 stars to was Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. And I know that some people hate Charles Dickens, but I really think that everybody should love him, okay? You should love Charles Dickens, okay? Because I do. And of course, I mean, like, that's a good reason, right? Anyways, so I do really, truly love Charles Dickens. I always have. I love his writing. I just love his way with words. So it kind of doesn't really matter to me. Okay, to a certain extent, obviously. It kind of doesn't matter to me too much what he's writing about, because he writes about it, like, he uses words so well. Like, I wish that I had that command of the English language, that I could just describe things like he does, and just shape your perspective of something with just a very clever use of words. And I don't have that skill, but I very much admire it in Charles Dickens. And Little Dorrit was a wonderful story, and I already spoke about it in a weekly wrap-up at length, so I won't go into any more details here, but I really loved reading about it. I loved the primary characters in the story, especially Dorrit. The rest of her family, I mean, you could do without them, but then you wouldn't have Dorrit, so you wouldn't have a book, right? So they're kind of necessary to the story. And I just like how everything works out in the story, and how all of the little pieces of the plot come together in the end. So anyways, it was a good story and I enjoyed it. So that was my one and only 5-star read for Victober. And that is how my books ranked for Victober and my thoughts about all of them. So if you read any of these, I would love to know in the comments what your thoughts were, if you enjoyed them or had other thoughts about them. And also, what did you read for Victober? How would you rank your Victober reads? And just in general, how was your experience with Victober if you participated? And will you participate next year? I know I will. So anyway, that was my Victober ranking. And thank you for stopping by and watching this video all the way through. And you were just so kind to hang out with me and chat about books so much. I love it. And I hope you have a wonderful year until the next Victober.